She was this gun-toting, whiskey-drinking broad.
The super epic fucking broad.
She was a pioneer in the industry.
She's also so famous and so controversial.
So controversial.
So she's kind of a big fucking deal.
Her story is so incredible. She belongs on this podcast because she's a broad you should know. Hello and welcome to Broads You Should Know, the podcast about amazing and noteworthy women from history. I am your host, Sarah Gorski, and I am here today with another excellent Irish broad for you. Now, we have covered a couple Irish broads so far on the podcast, including a couple weeks ago, we talked about Mary LaBelle Maloney. She was the Irish suffragist who rang a big bell every single time Winston Churchill opened his mouth. Personal hero of mine now. And way back when on the podcast, Chloe talked about Marjorie McCall in that Indestructible Women episode. Excellent episode if you haven't heard that one. And of course, another personal favorite of mine would be the Irish pirate queen, Grace O'Malley. She was the scourge of the British Empire and Queen Elizabeth. The first great stories in that episode. And today's Irish broad, though, she stumbled across my attention in my weekly prose digest, the Marginalian. I think I've talked about this before on the podcast. It's more or less a blog written by this incredible woman, Maria Popova. And in her own words, it is, quote, a record of my reading and reckoning with our search for meaning, sometimes through science and philosophy, sometimes through poetry and children's books, always through the lens of wonder, end quote. And I am just in love with Maria's blog. I'm obsessed with it. Every Sunday when I get my little digest, I eagerly read it and I send screenshots and I post them on Instagram. I'm mildly obsessed, Maria, if you're listening. And Maria and the Marginalian also happens to be that's where I also was turned on to the stories of Sofia Tolstoya and Anna Dostoevskaya a couple months ago. Geez, time is flying this year. But anyway, so in this week's email, there was this single line in the midst of the text that read, quote, in the savage winter of 1962, the coldest weather to strike Europe in 80 years, which didn't stop Dervla Murphy from mounting her bicycle in Ireland headed for India, a blackbird began roosting in Clark's elderberry, end quote. So that was from the digest about, something unrelated but happening in the same year. Now, I am not the kind of person who can read a line like that and not click on the link attached to it and read more about this Wonder Woman, Dervla Murphy, and behold, this incredible story that I'm about to tell you kind of revealed itself in the link that I clicked that Maria wrote up. And so here we are now talking about the marvelous Dervla Murphy. Dervla Maria Murphy was born in Lismore, Ireland on November 28th, 1931. And her father, Fergus, was the country librarian. Her mother, Kathleen, all we know about her, based on the things I've been reading, is that she had rheumatoid arthritis very badly. And when Dervla was just 6 months old, her mother was pretty much unable to walk due to this rheumatoid arthritis. In her memoir, Wheels Within Wheels, Dervla said, quote, for my 10th birthday, my parents gave me a secondhand bicycle and grandfather sent me a secondhand atlas. Already, I was an enthusiastic cyclist, though I had never owned a bicycle before, and soon after my birthday, I resolved to cycle to India one day. I have never forgotten the exact spot on a steep hill near Lismore where this decision was made. Halfway up, I rather proudly looked at my legs, slowly pushing the pedals around, and the thought came, if I went on doing this for long enough, I could get to India. End quote. There's another quote of hers from her biography, quote, now I saw how I could travel in reality, alone, independent, and needing very little money. A 10-year-old's decision to cycle to India might have seemed to many adults an amusing, childish whim, but giving me material for dreaming about something that I knew could be attained. It offered a healthier outlet for my imaginings than my usual escapist fantasies. So immediately, as a young girl, upon getting her bicycle, Dervla imagines riding to India. Her travel dreams, however, were hampered by the realities of life with an immobile mother. When she was 14, Dervla had to drop out of convent school to tend to her mother full time. And she would end up doing that for another long 16 years, approximately. And as a caretaker, she kind of was more or less trapped in her house, and she didn't have another job. She was caring for her mother. She did manage a couple short trips during this part of her life. By the way, I didn't dig up other information about the in-between period and more about her home life, really, other than the things that she wrote about. And I haven't read her work in depth, obviously. But she did apparently get to do a few short trips while she was caretaking for her mother. She went to Wales and South England in 1951. And then she went to Belgium, Germany, and France in 1952. And she also made 2 trips to Spain in 1954 and 56. And she started publishing some travel articles. She published in the Hibernia Journal and the Irish Independent newspaper. And she apparently wrote a couple travel books about her trips to Spain, her Spanish travel, but they were not accepted by the publishers. They got rejected. And then in 1858, Dervla's first partner that I know of, or that I found in the research, Godfrey, apparently died when he was abroad. And soon after this, her dad falls ill with nephritis. I had to look that up. I had never heard of nephritis before. And it is a complication of influenza. And the kidneys, I guess, stop functioning properly. So her dad ends up dying in 1961. And not very long after that, in August of 62, her mother also passes. Now, her mother, as we've already said, had a long debilitating illness, and her health deteriorated more and more over time. So her death was not shocking, and really it was kind of a relief to Dervla, who'd been looking after her, most of her adult life. Dervla described having the feeling, quote, "I was exalted by the realization of freedom." And relieved of these long caretaking duties, Dervla begins planning this big trip that she has been dreaming of since she turned 10. And then in January of 1963, during what would end up being Central Europe's harshest winter in 80 years, as Maria said in her blog, Dervla gets on her bicycle, lovingly named Roz, and she sets off for India with nothing but this little saddlebag strapped to her bike, which contains her passport and a camera, a map, 1 spare pair of nylon pants and nylon shirt, toothbrush, comb, writing paper, 2 pens, a copy of Blake's poems, and a pistol. That's it. Can you imagine? I imagine just when you're at the airport and you're looking at all of these stuffed suitcases for people that are traveling for one weekend that are stuffed full, they can't even fit in the overhead bins. Here, she's got this one little carry-on and just these few items for this trip halfway across the world. Amazing. She would write about that later. She would say, quote, "The hardships and poverty of my youth had been a good apprenticeship for this form of travel. I had been brought up to understand that material possessions and physical comfort should never be confused with success, achievement, and security." End quote. And Dervla sets off, and she would end bicycling pretty much the entire trip. Sometimes she had to go on foot or mule or in jeeps or buses, but mostly she was riding Roz, and she would bike through France and Italy and Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan until she finally arrived in India. Persia, I should say, modern day Iran was Persia in that time period. So all told, this journey to India took her 6 months, and it cost her only 64 pounds, British pounds, in case you're confused, not weight, the actual money. And since I am kind of a curious dork, we know this, I looked up that amount online, and that would be the equivalent today of a little bit over $2,000 US, which is still a crazy low amount for a 6-month trip halfway across the world. And Dervla would end up writing a book all about this trip called Full Tilt, Ireland to India with a Bicycle. Now, I'm going to confess to all of you, I have ordered her book, but it has not arrived yet. So I haven't read it. But Maria Popova, the Marginalian woman, she goes on and on about how incredibly beautiful Dervla's writing is. So I know that I'm going to love it when it finally gets here in like 2 days. Amazon says 2 days. Too late for this episode, but not too late for my heart, obviously. And as you can imagine, Dervla experiences some really extreme and intense moments during this trip. It's the 1960s, first of all, and she ends up leaving. This wasn't part of the plan, but she ends up leaving during this harshest winter in almost a century. At one point, when she's in Yugoslavia, it's so cold that she, quote, has an icicle firmly attached to her nose, and she, quote, gets blown off her saddle by the most ferocious wind she has ever experienced, tumbles down a 15-foot sloping ditch and into a stream frozen so solid that her impact produces not even a crack on the ice, crawls back onto the bicycle, eventually accepts a nightmarish ride in a rickety truck across 250 miles of frozen plain, which stretched with relentless white anonymity, and resumes on 2 wheels after the truck crashes into a tree, end quote. Dervla also tells this terrifying story from when she was in Serbia. Quote, from the near distance came a dull booming sound as soldiers blew up the gigantic accumulations of rock-hard snow, which, unless artificially loosened, would have dammed the river and sent its overflow rushing through the nearby town of Kuprija. It was awe-inspiring to see the wide, angry Morava swiftly sweeping its tremendous burden of ice and snow chunks through the vast wilderness of sullen, brown floodwaters. And my awe was soon justified when a massive wave came crashing across the road, swept me off Roz, and rolled me over and over, choking as I swallowed the muddy water and gasping as its iciness penetrated my clothes. Next, a branch of little roadside tree appeared above me, and pulling myself up by it, I found that the water, though still flowing strongly, was now no more than 3 feet deep. I looked for Roz, and during one appalling moment, thought she had disappeared. Then I saw a yellow handlebar grip in a ditch and hurried to rescue her, end quote. Elsewhere in the trip, she would watch 2 men in their snowplows trying to clear a snowdrift that was blocking the road, and their snowplow falls off of the edge of the mountain, and the 2 men die. She watches 2 men fall off the side of a mountain. At one point, when she's in Bulgaria, she is attacked by a pack of wolves, and one of them bites her on the shoulder. It's like holding on to her windbreaker, and it hangs off of her windbreaker until she's able to wrestle out her pistol and shoot it, scattering the pack of wolves. At one point also, during Persia, when she was in Persia, which is now the Islamic Republic of Iran, she shares a gross bed with, quote, a host of energetic fleas. Ooh, that's disgusting. And then, in the middle of the night, she is awakened by, quote, a 6-foot scantily clad Kurd who has peeled her bedding from her and is leaning over her in the moonlight, end quote. Dervla, without any hesitation, pulls the pistol out from under her pillow and she fires it at the ceiling, and this fucking creep man runs away, thank goodness. Insane stories. There's just a few of them. There's many more. But here's the thing that both Maria Popova and I find remarkable about Dervla specifically, is that despite these challenges that she is facing on the road alone with her bicycle and her pistol and her notebooks and her poetry book, she continuously is writing pretty much only about the breathtaking beauty all around her. the day after this fucking creep guy over her bed, the day after this, she writes, quote, "On the following morning came one of the most glorious experiences of the entire journey, a 15-mile cycle run in perfect weather around the base of Mount Ararat. This extraordinary mountain, which inspires the most complex emotions in the least imaginative traveler, affected me so deeply that I have thought of it ever since as a personality encountered rather than a landscape observed. Cycling day after day beneath a sky of intense blue through wild mountains whose solitude and beauty surpassed anything I had been able to imagine during my daydreams about this journey," end quote. And over in her writings, she's writing about all the beauty she sees. There's something about, travel writers these days are flying and taking the train, and to ride on a bicycle through the land is this extremely unique, slow observance of the things around her, right? And so I think her writing is infused with this kind of absorption, this slow absorption that she made all around her during these travels. Over and over, she's writing about the beauty. Maria Popova includes a lot of gorgeous quotes from the book in her entry on Dervla. So if you find yourself kind of drawn to her writing and drawn to some of these quotes, you really should check out Maria's post. I'm going to have the link up on Broads You Should Know, as always. So go check that out. Go fall in love with the marginalian, and then we can talk about it. And on this trip, too, Dervla especially falls in love with Iran and Afghanistan. She's traveling through these countries. When we talk about Iran and Afghanistan today, I feel, well, depending on how well-versed you are in the happenings of the world, they look very different now than they did in 1963. She's traveling in this unique window of time. And it was not usual or particularly socially acceptable in 1963 for women to travel alone. That was not like the norm, especially in those countries. But at this period of time, it's pre-Iranian Revolution, which that would happen in 1978. And it's pre-fall of the Afghan monarchy, which would be in 1973. And after those two major events, there was a huge upheaval in that part of the world, much of which we know is still going on today, including, not limited to, but including a major rollback on the freedoms and the safety of women in those countries, right? And this, by the way, what I just said here is a gross oversimplification of events in that area of the world. So as always, I encourage you to read more about those events on your own. I don't have time to do them justice without kind of cheating Dervla's story. But the whole point is Dervla's experience writing through those countries in that part of the world was really a very singular experience. And I don't know that there's any other writing that has, of a Westerner, I should say, that has really captured that time and that period with those kind of eyes. It's truly a remarkable thing. In Maria Popova's words, quote, "She encountered people from wildly different cultures whose boundless hospitality affirmed what she had to have already known in her bones to endeavor on such a dangerous journey at all. Quote, that for all the horrible chaos of the contemporary political scene, this world is full of kindness." End quote. That last part was Dervla's quote herself. Man, what a week. That quote kind of makes me cry a little. The world is full of kindness. Anyway, Dervla would make it to India and back again, and her book Full Tilt, published after her trip, in 1965 is when that came out, and it would just be the first of many books that she would write. Almost 24 books she ends up writing in her lifetime. She became a travel writer through and through, and she almost always was riding her bicycle on all her trips. Like, that was her primary mode of transportation. That's how she got around. She would travel to and write about Ethiopia and Peru and Cuba and Israel, Gaza, Madagascar, Nepal, Tibet, Baltistan, South Africa, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Romania, and Northern Ireland. That last one a little closer to home for her. When she went to Peru, she even brought her 9-year-old daughter, Rachel. She did not marry. She had a daughter with an Irish publisher who was married to somebody else, I guess. But she raised her daughter, Rachel, who's still alive today, and who's interviewed in various things. You'll see her name and her interview in the documentary about Dervla. But when they were in Peru together, when Rachel's 9, they traveled 1,300 miles in the Andes from Cajamarca to Cusco. And Rachel would end up going with Dervla on quite a few other trips. In an interview with The Guardian, Rachel said, quote, "People consider it insanity for us to set out with only basic supplies to a part of the country that had no roads, no hospitals, no services. But that was why we were there in the first place," end quote. And traveling did not become more glamorous than that first trip. Dervla and Rachel still faced many challenges during all of their trips, including at one point she broke 9 ribs. She was bitten by a scorpion once in Afghanistan. She apparently contracted amoebic dysentery, brucellosis, gout, hepatitis, and tick bite fever. She fractured her coccyx. She broke a foot. She had a fall in Palestine, which meant that she actually needed a new hip replacement. But apparently, the most terrible of all of her injuries, pain-wise, was when she had a triple tooth abscess when she was in Cameroon. Yikes! As I say, as someone who's just been dealing with my own tooth drama, that does indeed sound like a nightmare. And I should also say, like, her writing, I talked a bunch about the beauty of her writing and how breathtaking it is, but she wasn't always focused just on the beauty. Some of her travels took her to places where there was tons of political upheaval, and she was not afraid to talk about it, and talk about it really openly. And she traveled to places including, which particularly relevant at this moment in time, she wrote about her time in a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan. In 2015, she published her book Between the River and the Sea, which was specifically about what was going on in Israel and Palestine. She wrote about hotspots in Africa and about the population there being affected by AIDS. She wrote about Northern Ireland during the Troubles in the 1970s in her book A Place Apart. And not all of her readers appreciated when her work did feel more political. She wasn't particularly a diehard socialist. Her biographers kind of say that about her, but she wasn't afraid of talking about these difficult topics, and she wasn't really interested in making anybody, including her readers, happy. So she just kind of kept on writing about all of these experiences. And she had this very unique ability to connect with almost every person she met, no matter what country she was in and what language people spoke. And she so eloquently wrote about all of these encounters that in her writing, she really was able to bring out the human experience in each of these moments of her travels. I think of, like, the only other person I feel like I have read that evokes kind of a similar experience would be like Anthony Bourdain, right? But this is before his time. This is starting in the 1960s. Absolutely profound connectivity to the human experience. According to the New York Times, when she received the Edward Stanford Award for Outstanding Travel Writing in 2021, it was said, quote, What you have is this mixture of open honesty combined with fearlessness. You'll ask anybody anything, and they'll open up and talk to you. And it's your ability to give yourself to the people you're talking to that makes for great revelations. End quote. I'm sad to tell you, I discovered Dervla a few years too late because she just passed away in May of 2022. I feel like of all the broads we've covered, I've never been so close to a broad that was just alive, which is a little heartbreaking. But she lived long enough into the digital era that there are many recordings and interviews, both audio and video, of her throughout her entire lifetime. I did like a very quick Spotify search and 10 different podcast episodes came up, and I listened to a few of them, and some of them are interviews about her herself, she's talking about her experiences and all the things that she went through. And her voice is rich and her stories are even richer. And I highly recommend you look up a few, listen for yourself. There's also a really lovely obituary in the New York Times. That is worth giving a read too. Some of the quotes and things that I brought into this episode were from that obit. It was really quite good. There's also a documentary, I think I mentioned earlier, called Who is Dervla Murphy, which came out in 2016. Also a really marvelous piece of work. Both her and her daughter Rachel are interviewed in it. And it is very close to the end of her life. She's pretty old, but she still is talking and laughing about all her experiences. And it's amazing to watch this woman who's experienced so much. I'm getting emotional again. I don't know why. It's amazing to watch this little old lady talk about all that she did. And she doesn't talk about it as it's anything even very special. Whereas I think about this trip on a bicycle across the world as this incredible feat that most people couldn't accomplish. And here's just this little old lady. I didn't mention this earlier, but a lot of the research about her and then you also see in the documentary that she lived even though she became kind of a very celebrated travel writer, she lives this incredibly simplistic life in Ireland where she's basically just got her books and she doesn't have a dishwasher or a heater or anything like that. And she sleeps in what she calls a cowshed. It's she lives this super simple little Irish life. And yet she experienced the world in such a vast, profound way. It's so mind-blowing to me. That's the gist of her story. I just want to close out Dervla's episode with this amazing story from her book, Full Tilt. Quote, once on a blistering hot day on a desolate road here in Iran, an American engineer stopped in his Jeep to offer Dervla a ride. American man, what the hell are you doing on this goddamn road? Me, having taken an instant dislike to him. Cycling. I can see that, but what the hell for? For fun. Are you a nutcase or what? Give me that bike and I'll stick it on behind and you get in here and we'll get out of this goddamn frying pan as fast as we can. This track isn't fit for a camel. When you're on a cycle, instead of in a Jeep, it doesn't feel like a frying pan. Moreover, if you look around, you'll notice that the landscape compensates for the admittedly deplorable state of the road. In fact, I enjoy cycling through this sort of country, but thank you for the kind offer. Goodbye. As I rode on, he passed me and yelled, "You are a goddamn nutcase." I regard this sort of life, with just Roz and me, and the sky and the earth, as just sheer bliss. End quote. Okay, but I kind of lied, because I actually want to close out with one more quote. These are both they were too good and I couldn't choose. I think this next quote perfectly encapsulates Dervla's view of the world that she traveled so widely in her life. She said, quote, "What a wonderful place this world is." I know if you're watching on YouTube, I'm crying. I did not actually expect that would happen. There's something about this woman absorbing the beauty of the world and seeing so much beauty even amidst difficult things. And I don't know, I'm just really profoundly moved by it. And I know I'm also emotional after a long week, after the Supreme Court bullshit that we're living through in America right now. But I think writing like Dervla's just helps remind us that the world isn't all for shit and that there is still beauty out there, and that connecting and opening to people just reveals the beautiful humanity kind of at the heart of it. So I recommend you go check out that article Maria wrote on her blog and read more in depth about Dervla's writing, and maybe even read Dervla's book herself. It's just really beautiful, and she was a beautiful person, and the world is poor without her, but richer for all that she left behind. To learn more about Dervla Murphy, see pictures of her and Roz and quotes from this episode, as well as that link to that entry on the Marginalian, head on over to broadsyoushouldknow.com. While you're there, click on over to the About page and read more about me. My bio, photo, links to my stuff, all right there. Are you following Broads You Should Know on social? We are on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube at Broads You Should Know, and Twitter at BYSK Podcast. Subscribe on YouTube. Give me a comment. Tell me how good my mascara holds up while I'm crying. I want to hear it. It also helps new listeners to find us. To suggest a broad, fill out the form on our website or email us at broadsyoushouldknow@gmail.com. If you're a fan of the podcast, help spread the word about us by sharing this or another episode with your friends and family. And leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That also helps new listeners to find us. Broads You Should Know is produced by me, Sarah Gorski, and edited by Chloe Skye, with original music by Darren Callahan. Finally, if you really enjoyed hearing this story of Dervla Murphy, then I highly recommend you check out our other Irish broads, also incredible badasses. Mary LaBelle Maloney, the suffragist who shut up Winston Churchill, Marjorie McCall, who could not die, and Pirate Queen Grace O'Malley. See you next week for another Broad You Should Know.